So here is part 2 of evolution main points, notes, and interpretation. So individual organisms don't evolve, populations do. That's an important idea. So the genes that you are born with aren't going to change during your lifetime. Like you're not going to get a new DNA sequence. And so you either have adaptive traits or you don't. And so you can't change that genetic makeup in your lifetime. The next generation will get a genetically unique set of traits. And so it's over time and reproduction that traits are either adaptive or they're not. And so it's the population that changes over time, the population that adapts by having more and more of a particular trait being favored by natural selection. So populations adapt because adaptations are based on inherited traits. So if you think of bur oak trees have a crazy thick, rough bark. And they also live or exist and thrive on the edge of the deciduous forest at a place called an ecotone where the deciduous forest and the prairie come together. So that's what an ecotone is where two major ecosystems live side by side. And so there's a blending of the two. And so prairies are well adapted to periodic fire. And a thriving prairie is going to have regular prairie fires. If you're a tree living on the edge of the prairie, you're going to have to know how to deal with fire. And one adaptation to surviving fire is oak trees having very thick, tough bark. And so the quick, fast-burning prairie fire is not going to get hot enough to start a thick-barked oak tree on fire. And so that's kind of the idea. All right, so how would an adaptation such as this come to exist? Well, imagine that some oak trees have thinner bark and some have thicker bark in the population. Well, if you are this set of oak trees, some with thick bark, some with thin, over time, the ones with thick bark are going to survive, produce acorns in the next generation of thick-barked trees in that population, compared to the ones with a thin bark, maybe aren't doing as well. They don't survive as well with that fire, and so they're not going to pass on the thin-barked trait to the next generation. And so it's that population of oak trees that adapt, not individuals. So keep that in mind. It's an important understanding when we talk about evolution in organisms. It's also worth knowing that common language, we use adapt to mean adjust or get used to something new. So you get a new schedule and you adapt to the new schedule at the semester change or the quarter change. And so adapt in common language isn't always the same as when we talk in science. So just make sure that we understand that is a reality of our language understanding of adaptation too. All right, trends in the fossil record. What does the fossil record tell us? Well, it says that older layers of rock, going from those deeper, older layers to more recent layers, the younger layers, there is a trend in fossil organisms from simple to getting more complex. And I didn't mention this before, but I just want to re-emphasize this idea. We have also found in the fossil record that some organisms from prior time on Earth showed transition characteristics over time, transitional fossils. So Archaeopteryx is an example of a bird-like reptile. So reptiles have teeth, and Archaeopteryx had teeth like a reptile. But birds have feathers, and Archaeopteryx had feathers. And so it had these characteristics that were reptilian and bird-like. And so that gives us some idea to think about how organisms might have changed from reptilian into what we know as today's birds. We can use comparative morphology. So morphology is a study of something's form. And so we can study the form of these organisms here. All of these have wings, an adaptation for flight. But if we look at them underneath their skin at a deeper level, they're very different organisms, insects, mammals, and birds. And so these organisms developed a similar adaptation, but are coming from very different historical lineages. And so these are what are known as analogous structures. So different organisms solve a problem through adaptation in their own unique way, but they still develop that adaptation for flight. And so comparative morphologists study body plan structure among groups of organisms. And in the case of these critters here pictured, or if you compare the fish versus a dolphin, their flippers or their fins for swimming, those are what are known as analogous structures. So they have the same adaptation, but they evolved separately in different lines of organisms historically. But then we can also talk about structures that differ outwardly and maybe have different adaptations, but their internal structure is very similar. And so we call those homologous structures. And those indicate that organisms had a common ancestor and they evolved differently to have slightly different adaptations. So vertebrate forelimbs. So that would include our arm. And so if we look at our arm bones and compare that with other vertebrates, we might have different adaptations, but the bone structure is the same. And then we can also talk about what are known as vestigial structures. And that's when an organism had a structure that was useful at one point in time, but then over time becomes less and less useful. And so there's a little remnants of it in the population, but not full-blown function. And whale hip bones would be an example of this. So homologous structures, they have a similar structure pointing to a common ancestor, humerus bone, radius and ulna, carpals, phalanges, same bone structure, but the way those bones grow and develop in these different populations show very different adaptations. And so point to a common ancestor, but very different externally in how they function. So homologous structures is what these are referring to. And then vestigial structures, the fossil record shows us whale-like creatures that had legs at one point, and then over time, the legs got smaller and smaller in the fossil record to the point that present-day whales have hip bones and a tiny little femur, but it doesn't even stick out the side, so they don't have any use for it. So these are called vestigial structures. The human appendix is thought to be a vestigial structure as well. In some organisms, it has a function. In us, it really doesn't have a function. You can also explore biochemical analysis to compare the lines of evolution in organisms. So biochemical analysis would look at organic molecules like proteins or gene sequences in their DNA. So Darwin did not have technology to consider this as evidence toward evolution, but we can use that today. And in fact, it helps us have a clearer picture of genetic relationships across time with organisms. So protein comparisons, looking at the amino acid sequence in proteins that all organisms might share. So one example of that is cytochrome C. It's an enzyme that is needed in cellular respiration. And so in order for cellular respiration to happen, you need this protein, cytochrome C. But the cytochrome C is not exactly identical from organism to organism. And so how similar they are shows a closer amount of relatedness, evolutionarily speaking. This would be another example of comparing human hemoglobin with other organisms that have hemoglobin. So the amino acid difference in human hemoglobin from a gorilla is 1. A rhesus monkey, 8 amino acid differences, and so on. As you move down, less and less difference, or less and less similarity in their amino acid sequence. And if you look superficially, a gorilla looks more like us than a rhesus monkey, more like us than a mouse, and so on. And so you can see this superficial relatedness in comparison as biochemically showing the same pattern. And then finally, once we determine evolutionary relationships through all of these types of study and all these types of evidence, we develop what are known as cladograms or phylogenetic trees. And it's just trying to look at a way of relating organisms, evolutionarily speaking, by the features that they share or don't share. And so vertebrates would be something that all of these have in common. Bony skeleton, everything past the bony skeleton point all have bones, but sharks have cartilage skeletons. Or forelimbs versus not limbs, okay? And so a phylogenetic tree is just taking characteristics and using those to separate them in lineages. And then genetics can be used to help pinpoint where these separations happen. So this is just, again, an organizational tool to help us see relatedness historically in organisms based on their fossil record and current genetic record. So, and this is the wrap on evolution main and natural selection main points notes. I hope it was helpful, and have a good end of the week and quarter.